Hey guys, I'm AH Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now there's a technique that I use so often in cosplay, I think I actually use it on every single project, and that is bias tape, or using bias tape in my projects. So today I thought it'd be a really good idea to cover the basics of using bias tape in cosplay because it is such a common thing in sewing and comes in so handy in the world of cosplay as well. And I thought I'd also give some cosplay specific examples on how I've used bias tape in my projects. So consider this a bit of a cosplay tips video, but also a bit of a mini tutorial at the same time. Wow, I do those. I haven't done a tutorial in a long time. Now bias tape is often used as a nice way to finish things off cleanly, like finishing off your seams and hems and stuff like that, but it can also be a decorative trim, which is where it really comes in handy in the world of cosplay. But before I talk about some of the uses and ways I've used it, I think it might be actually more important to discuss what is bias tape. The simple answer is bias tape is a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias of the fabric. The longer answer is that all woven fabric, so non-stretch, so not your knits, not your spandexes, etc. All woven fabrics have a weft and a warp and are made with a pattern like that, right? They're woven together, hence why they're called woven fabrics. The bias is the 45-degree angle that is created when those two meet. This right here, going across. And bias tape is a tape or a strip that is cut at that angle, which on the surface sounds like not a great usage of your fabric. Like that cuts right into the middle of your fabric. Why do we want our tape on the bias? Well, the easy way to explain this is that the warp and weft of your fabric has absolutely no give. As an example, I actually have a little piece of bias tape that I've pre-cut out right here. So it is on the 45-degree angle. You can actually tell because you can see the selvage edge right here. But if I try to pull it on the weft or the warp, there's no give. If I pull it on the bias, which is cut on, there's a lot of give there. When something is cut on the bias, it hangs a little differently, it behaves a little bit differently because it's not necessarily kept down by that crisscross pattern. It has a lot more give and it has a lot more stretch to it, which makes it easier to manipulate. So you can put this around a round hem or you can put this around a round armhole. Essentially, it's easier to manipulate while the warp and weft is not. It's very, very difficult. And there are many people out there who will never actually realize just how different the warp weft versus bias is with cutting until it's too late. But yeah, that is the basics of what bias tape actually is. So now if you're considering using bias tape on your project, you might be wondering, well, where do I get bias tape or how can I make it? So most fabric stores and most craft stores as well will actually sell little packages like these over here of pre-made bias tapes. They're usually in a very specific fabric and there's usually quite a variety of colors, but not a lot of different width options depending on what you're looking for. They usually vary from your typical seam allowance widths. I personally really enjoy making my own bias tape, and making your own bias tape means that you make it with the fabric you have with you. So if you want your bias tape, if it's a trim, to match your costume exactly, then this is the perfect way. And that's why I usually use my own homemade bias tapes, because then they match the other elements of the costume perfectly if I'm using the bias tape as trim. There are several ways of making bias tape, but I will share my favorite way of doing it, and I consider this a pretty easy, beginner-friendly way of doing bias tape.
To demonstrate cutting out your own bias tape, I'm going to use this little piece of scrap fabric with the visible selvage edge. I am going to be using a see-through ruler, some chalk, and also these little scissors here. The selvage edge is really easy to work off of because you can make that perfect 90-degree angle of the fabric in order to find your true bias on the fabric. I line up my see-through ruler on the very corner so you have a perfect little inch square, and I mark the top corner as you see me doing here. That's because this makes a perfect 45-degree angle on that corner, and then I can just use my marking tool to mark that down, which is the perfect bias of this fabric. Now that I have my perfect bias marked out, I can take my ruler and mark out how wide I need my bias strip to be. In my case, I want a 1/2 inch finished bias strip, and because there's 4 layers that got folded in, I need a 2-inch wide strip. So I now have a parallel line, and this marks my bias tape. I take my scissors and I cut along the line, and then I have my bias tape finished and ready to go to be worked into whatever project I'm working on. While this is a very short piece for demonstration, it could still be very useful depending on what you're working on.
There are also a lot of ways to actually apply your bias tape on, but I will cover 3 different ones. So let's go over to the sewing room and I will show you those 3 different methods.
For this first method, you're going to have to actually start at the ironing board. So iron your piece flat and then pull both edges in, fold them in gently, and have them meet dead center in the middle. Being extremely careful with your fingers, start pressing down those folds so that they stay in place. Once pressed, your piece should look something like this. Now it's time to fold the edges in on each other once again. So fold your piece in half, but you want to leave a little bit of an overlap, kind of like what you see me doing here, just about by 1/8 of an inch or less. Just a tiny little bit of a lip on the edge. Now you're going to grab your piece of fabric that you're going to be attaching your bias tape to, and you're basically going to open up that fold line you've made and then place the fabric inside so that the edge of the fabric is right on that fold line. Take some pins and pin it in place so that it doesn't shift when you are sewing it afterwards. Now you're going to bring it over to the sewing machine and sew for about 1/8 of an inch or less away from the very edge of your bias tape. This step is the reason we have a little bit of extra overlap on the underside of the bias tape, so that if this shifts around at all underneath where you can't see, you will know it will still catch. See here, you can see that it's a little bit wider of a stitch on the other side, and that's because of that little underlap that we carefully placed beforehand on the ironing board. For method number 2, you're going to start by pinning the good side of your bias tape to the good side of your fabric, so the side that you'll actually see on the final product. Then bring it over to the sewing machine and I sew with 1/2 inch of seam allowance, because in my case I'm working with a 2-inch wide bias strip and I'm eventually wanting a finished 1/2 inch of bias tape on the final product. It should look nice and even on either side and kind of look like this at this point. Now back to the ironing board, and we are going to press that so that the seam allowance is up towards the bias tape, just so it's nice and flat. This gives you a good idea of what it should look like on both sides at this particular step. Now we're going to flip it over to the other side, and just very similarly to what we did last time, you're going to bring that edge in to meet the middle of your seam allowance from before, and then press it down flat again. And once again, we're going to fold it over so that it meets the edge of your seam allowance, right where you sewed before. Press it down nice and flat, and be careful for your fingers once again. Now we're going to bring it over to the sewing machine again, and you can pin at this stage, but I decided not to, and you're going to bring it to the side and sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, or less if you feel like it. This is very similar to the other way of doing the bias tape, but instead it's already sewn down. Many people accredit this method as being the proper way of applying a bias tape by machine and consider it a very clean application for applying it. Our third method begins very similarly to the way we just did for the second method. You're going to place your fabric bias tape good side to good side of your chosen fabric and pin it in place. Like before, we're going to sew it with 1/2 inch of seam allowance because our bias tape is about 2 inches wide. back over to the ironing board, and you're going to press so that the seam allowance is facing upwards towards your bias tape. And then we're going to flip it over and bring that unfinished edge of the bias tape into the very center towards our seam allowance, and press it down nice and flat again. And now we bring that folded edge over to meet the edge of our seam allowance, just like before. Now you may be wondering how this method differs from the other, and well, this time we hand sew it down using what is called a slip stitch. A slip stitch is a hand sewing stitch where you basically catch a little bit of fabric near your sewing line from before and catch a little bit of your bias tape from the underside, hence slipping up to stitch the edge. This stitch makes the application almost invisible as you don't see stitch marks on either side. Now, if you don't mind some stitches being seen on the underside or the wrong side of your fabric, a whip stitch is also a very good alternative. It is very similar to the slip stitch, but is a much faster and more visible version of the stitch. Depending on what you are working on, a slip stitch or a whip stitch can be interchangeable, or one can be preferred over the other depending on the look that you want. Here's what the finished version looks like for method number 3, where you can see some of the whip stitch and some of the slip stitch and how they differ from each other, but how it looks on the other side with no visible top stitching. It's a very satisfying method, and all 3 of these methods are very good ways to apply bias tape.
And now keep in mind, these are not the only ways to actually apply bias tape. Other people have several other methods. People all around the world will have different methods, but these are 3 that I will often use, and they're pretty beginner friendly. These are the basics of using your bias tapes. Now let's discuss where we can actually use some of these bias tape applications that we've just talked about. I will oftentimes use bias tape as a way to finish a seam, especially if it's a slightly bulkier kind of awkward seam to finish otherwise. And that means binding the seam allowance so that it doesn't fray. That's actually what I did on my Princess Zelda cosplay, my original design. On the inside of the sleeve here, because I had this awkward amount of fabric, and this fabric frays a lot. I used bias tape on the inside in order to finish it, and I actually used a zigzag stitch instead of a single stitch like I showed you before, because I knew this was going to be a very bulky and awkward seam, and the zigzag stitch guaranteed it would catch all those edges. So that's actually a really good way to actually do that kind of finish as well. It's a totally viable way. You don't just have to single stitch. In this case, it worked a lot better for me. You can also use bias tapes as a hem. This is also from my Princess Zelda cosplay, and the entire thing has bias tape on the hem. Actually, this cosplay has a ton of bias tape on it, even for decorations, but I just cut really wide strips of bias tape for the hem because I realized I was working with a circle, so if I had just done a strip, it wouldn't have fit. This was very easy to manipulate, very, very easy to apply, and ended up looking really, really nice on the bottom. Another example of it being used as a trim and a hem is on my Madoka cosplay. This I did with the hand sewing method, so I sewed it down on this side and then hand finished it on this side. And that's because I didn't want any visible top stitching along this edge. It ended up turning out really good, and I'm really proud of this bias tape application. But Madoka definitely on that hem of her skirt has that very iconic red line along the petals, so I knew I needed to do that, and this was the perfect way to make it both a trim that matched my entire cosplay and also a nice finished edge for the silk skirt. So these are just some basics for understanding and using bias tape, and I could go into more detail because there are so many usages for bias tape out there. They don't just need to be on hems and seam finishes. There's a lot of other decorative, really cool things you can do with it. Not to mention there's specific techniques for working around different corners. Corners like these. This is its own separate technique, and there's different techniques for also joining it very effectively. So if you are interested in those techniques as well, do let me know. Like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and let me know in the comments that you'd be interested in more tutorials about bias tape or even other basic techniques like this that can be incorporated into your cosplays. It's amazing how much basic techniques can lead to more complicated costumes sometimes, and I think it's really fascinating and really fun. And if I can share that information with you, I would love to do so. So be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and let me know if you'd like to see those videos. And I guess in the meantime, I shall see you all in the next video. See you later!